Hey Kitty, you excited for the new year? You excited about New Year's Eve?
Yeah.
No? Alright, let's go code then.
Hello everyone. This video is going to get uploaded right before the start of 2019. In fact, depending on where you live in the world, it already is 2019. Just a few weeks ago, in the first week of December 2018, something huge happened in the WordPress universe. WordPress officially launched their new block editor. Now, there's a lot of hype surrounding the editor, there's a lot of fear and confusion, so hopefully this tutorial demystifies some of that. And also, I thought this was the perfect video to follow on the heels of the 10 days of JavaScript, because the new block paradigm in WordPress is primarily powered by JavaScript, not PHP. So in this lesson, we are going to continue to practice and develop our JavaScript skill set. Just a quick shameless promotion, I actually filmed this lesson as part of my 25-hour premium WordPress developer course. If you find this lesson helpful, you might enjoy the full course. You can always check it out on Udemy. There's a link to it in the description for this video. Also, if you're wondering where in the world the full stack premium JavaScript course is, don't worry, it's coming soon. Having said all of that, I want to send out a huge thank you to all of my subscribers. I hope you have a beautiful 2019, and let's enjoy this video. Hello everyone. In this lesson, we are going to learn how to code our own new block type. Now, when I say block, what does that mean? What's the context here? Well, in versions 5.0 and later of WordPress, whenever you create or edit a page or post, so posts, add new, this editing experience for the content uses a block paradigm. So as we type, each new paragraph is considered an independent block, right? And you can click to reorder them or drag and drop to reorder them. Now, these are just simple paragraphs, but there are other types of blocks. Out of the box, by default, WordPress comes with paragraphs, heading, lists, columns, buttons, images. You get the idea. But aside from these default block types that WordPress comes with, we can create our own new custom block types as developers. So right now, let me give you a sneak peek of what we are going to be building together in this lesson. We see this block type named My Cool Border Box with a smiley face. And if I click that, we see this Your Cool Border Box. There's an input where I can type strawberry, and then there's a color picker. So maybe I will choose a color that matches strawberry. Okay, and then I can go ahead and publish this post. And then if I view it on my front end, we can see here are the default paragraph blocks, but here is that custom border box block. We see the word that I typed in, and we also see that color that I chose. And just to show you the reusable nature of blocks, I could add another My Cool Border Box. So if I added it again, maybe this time I will say, I like oranges. And then for the color, obviously, I would choose orange. And maybe I want this orange box to sit down below the other paragraphs, so I can just click Move Down to send it down. Go ahead and click Update. And if I refresh the front end, there you have it. Now, I realize this is very ugly, right? This is not the pinnacle of graphic design. But that's not the point of this lesson. Our goal with this lesson is just to get you familiar with the very basics of coding your own new block type. Once you've got a grasp of the basic concepts, it's up to you to take the idea and run with it and create something that's actually good looking and actually useful. So, without further ado, let's get started. Behind the scenes, I just removed all of the code that was powering that custom block type. So now we can start together and move forward. In order to create and register a new custom block type, let's begin by creating a new plugin. Now, earlier in this course, we already learned how to create a plugin, so that's nothing new. So for the next few steps, I'm going to move pretty quickly. But let's begin by navigating to the directory where you've installed WordPress, and we are looking for the folder named WP Content. Inside that, we're looking for the folder named Plugins. And inside this Plugins folder, let's just create a brand new empty folder. We can name it whatever we want, but I'm going to call it My Cool Border Box. Okay, then let's open up this new folder in our favorite text editing program. Okay, in this new folder, let's use the text editor to create a new file. The name doesn't matter as long as it ends in .php. So I chose plugin.php. And I'm actually just going to paste in a bit of boilerplate code. You can find this code in the description or linked resources for this video lesson. Because we've already created a plugin earlier in the course, I'm not going to type this out letter by letter with you. That would just be a waste of time. There's not a whole lot of educational material going on in this code. We're basically just registering a new plugin, and then we are loading a JavaScript file at the right place at the right time. This is because the new block paradigm is primarily powered by JavaScript, not by PHP. So again, I will include a link to this code so you can just copy and paste it into your PHP file, just like I did here. Okay, let's go ahead and save that file. And now let's create another new file, but this time a JavaScript file. So use my text editor, new file. I'm going to name it my-block.js. Technically, you can name it anything you want as long as it ends in .js. I'm going with my-block because that's what I've included in the boilerplate PHP, right? That's the file that our PHP is going to try to load. Okay, now let's jump into that JavaScript file. And before we write any real code, let's first write an annoying alert pop-up message just as a test to see if our file is being loaded. And let's say this is a test. Let's go ahead and save this. And then back in the WordPress admin dashboard, let's go activate our new plugin. So in the left-hand sidebar, look for plugins. So here it is, My Cool Border Box, version 1.0 by Brad. Let's go ahead and click activate. And now let's test things out to see if our JavaScript file is being loaded. So let's go to the edit screen, right? Posts, add new. Awesome, there's that pop-up. This is a test. That means our JavaScript is loading at the right place at the right time, and now we can finally get down to business and get to the actual educational part of this lesson. So let's get rid of this test alert, and what we actually want to do is begin working with the WP object that WordPress adds to the global scope. We can look inside the WP object for another object named blocks. And it contains a method named register block type. Okay, within the parentheses, we want to give this method two arguments. So just as placeholders, we could say a comma b. The first argument is a name that we make up for our new block type. I'm going to say Brad/borderbox. The first part of the name before the slash is the namespace. The idea here is that even if a different plugin had a custom block type named BorderBox, there would not be a naming conflict because of the beginning few letters and then the slash. So you can just choose your name or a few unique letters, and then obviously you can name your block type whatever you want as well. Okay? The second argument that we want to pass this register block type method, so instead of b, we want to pass it an object. So curly brackets to create an object literal, and then inside these brackets, let's drop down. Okay, and in this object, we want to include several different properties. So type these out with me. Title, colon. For now, let's just set all the properties to a temporary placeholder X. Let's just get the skeleton up and running, and then we can come back and place real values. So title, icon, category, attributes, edit, and finally, save. So this is the overall anatomy or skeleton of a block type. Now let's start filling in each one of these values. So for title, instead of X, let's include a string of text, and I will say my cool border box. So you could think of it as this is the human-friendly readable name, and this is the computer-friendly variable name. Okay, next up, icon. I'm going to include a string of text and say smiley. Earlier in the course, we already learned about dash icons. Remember, you can Google for WordPress dash icons and then choose from any of the tons of different icons that WordPress ships with. It's up to you. I'm going with the smiley face icon. For category, I'm going to say common. This just controls where your block type shows up in the block chooser interface. So there's common, there's layout, embeds, formatting, widgets. You get the idea. I'm going with common. For attributes, we want to include an object. So curly brackets, let's drop down. We can think of attributes as sort of the raw data that powers our block. When it comes to the border box that we're building, we only need to keep track of 2 pieces of data. Number 1, we need to keep track of whatever text the user types in. And number 2, we need to keep track of the color that they select. So for attributes, let's say content. You can make up whatever name you want. You could call this text. You could call this pizza. Call it unicorn. The name does not matter. I'm just going to call it content. Then we set this to an object, and then we just describe what it should be. So type, it should be a string of text. So the content should not be an array. It should not be a number. It should just be a simple string of text. Okay, let's include comma here. We also want to keep track of the color that the user selects. So color, set that to an object. Let's also say the type should be a string, right? A string of text or a color code. And that's all we need for attributes, right? We just have those 2 pieces of data that we want to keep track of. Okay, and finally, let's take care of edit and save. This is where the real magic happens. So edit controls the interface that the user sees in the WordPress editing screen, and save controls what HTML actually gets output into the post, right? So save controls what you would see on the front end for that block. Now for both of these, instead of X, what we actually want is a function. So function, parentheses, curly brackets. I like to drop down inside the body of the function. Let's do the same thing for save. Instead of X, give it a function, parentheses, curly brackets. Now within the parentheses for both of these functions, let's include a parameter named props. I don't want to jump into the rabbit hole of what props is. For now, all we need to know is that when WordPress works with our custom block type, when it calls these edit and save functions, it's going to pass into it different methods and data. And by including props here, we will have access to those methods and that data. All right, now within the edit and save functions, we want to return something. To really oversimplify things, we want to return HTML. But it's not like we can just include a string of simple HTML. This will not work. Instead, we need to construct our HTML in a way that WordPress will understand. And as of the date that I'm recording this lesson, WordPress is using a library named React. So we want to create our HTML or our user interface or our DOM elements in a React-ish way. Now, if you've never worked with the React library before, or maybe if you've never even heard of React, that's a-okay. We don't need to know very much at all about React in order to get up and running here. For now, all we need to know is that in React, there are 2 main ways of creating an element. There's the manual technical way, and then there's a super easy and intuitive way. Let's begin with the easy and intuitive way. Now this might seem like a tangent, but trust me, it's super related. Right now I want you to open up a new tab in your web browser and visit BabelJS.io. Or you can just Google for BabelJS. From this website, I want you to click on the Try It Out link up in the navigation menu. Okay, now check this out. In the left-hand column, let's type a bit of HTML. let's create a div element, right? So opening tag, closing tag. And maybe inside the div tags, let's just say hello. Okay, now let's look at what the Babel tool automatically generated for us in the right-hand column. So we can see that it's using the React library and it's using a method named createElement, and then it's passing that method 3 arguments. So the first thing is the type of element that you're creating. So this could be a div or a heading level 3 or a paragraph, right? So if I come over to the left-hand column and change this from a div to a for an anchor or link, you can see the automatically generated code updates, right? We see an A here. All right, now the second argument that createElement takes is the attributes for this element. So check this out. Over on the left-hand side, if we give our opening A tag an href of just a £sign for a test, well, we see that reflected in the generated code, right? That's the second argument, any attributes for the element. And then finally, the third argument is the content, or the children for the element. In this case, it's just a string of text, right? Hello. But over in the left-hand column, what if instead of hello, we wanted to nest a span element inside our link, and that's where we would say hello. Well, now we can see that the third argument is another call to React createElement, right? This element is nested inside this element. Now, remember when I said that there's 2 main ways of creating an element in React? I said that there's the manual or technical way, and there's the super easy and intuitive way. Now, you might be scratching your head saying, what's going on? I mean, the left-hand column is just HTML, but it's not. So this looks like HTML, but it's actually a syntax named JSX. JSX is an incredibly useful syntax where we can write code that looks like HTML, and then behind the scenes, it does all of the hard work for us and converts it into the appropriate React.createElement code. And that is the type of code that WordPress wants or needs. So let's get back to the real task at hand here. We want to create an HTML user interface with maybe a label that says, your cool border box. And then below that, we want an input field where the user can type in their words. So over in the left-hand column, let's make that happen. So maybe we would have a heading level 3 that says, your cool border box. And then below that, we would have an input field. Now, I see an error message right here, and that's because in JSX, you can only have one top level or root element. To get around this, we usually just wrap all of our JSX in a wrapper div, right? So div, close that wrapper div out down here. We can indent just to stay organized. And now we see a different error, and that's because in JSX, every element needs to be closed. So inside the input, let's include the self-closing /. Now in HTML5, we wouldn't need this. But this isn't technically HTML. It's JSX, and it's got its own rules and quirks and tips and tricks. Okay, let's say that this input has a type of text. Okay, now a bit later on in the lesson, below the input, we would include the color picker tool right about here. But for now, let's not worry about the color picker. Let's just get our input field up and running first. So we just wrote this intuitive, easy to work with JSX code. Now what we want to do is copy and paste the right-hand column into our JavaScript file. We don't need to include the use strict, so I'm just going to select and copy all of this, copy it into my clipboard, back in our JavaScript file within our edit method. What do we want to return? We don't want to return a simple string of text. What we want to return is the code that's in our clipboard, so paste it in. Now, technically, we could leave this code as is and it would work as of today. Because as of the date that I'm filming this, WordPress loads the React library into the global scope so we can access it just like this. But there's no guarantee that it's always going to be that way, right? WordPress might change in the future. So the official WordPressy way of doing this is to get rid of the word React and instead say wp.element.createElement. Currently, the official WordPress software is using the exact React createElement method, but who knows, maybe 6 months to a year from now, they will need to modify that method. Or maybe they would adopt a different library that's very similar to React, but isn't React exactly. Basically, this is just an official WordPress abstraction layer. And while you could technically write react.createElement, this is the future-proof way of doing things. This is the WordPress way of doing things. So it's a bit sloppy of me to leave React here as well as down here, but I don't want to waste time in this video having you watch me change this to WP element each time we copy and paste from the Babel tool. Okay, moving on. Before we save this file and test it out in the WordPress admin, let's come down to our save method, and within the body of our function, let's just return null. This is just a temporary placeholder. Eventually, we will want to output HTML for the front end of our website. But for now, just so we can test our edit interface, this will do the trick. So let's go ahead and save the file, and then back in WordPress, go ahead and refresh your edit screen, your post-edit screen. And now if I try to add a block, it shows up under most used for me, but since you've never used it before, you would need to click into common blocks. That's the category that we chose, and there it is, my cool border box. Go ahead and click on it, and there we see it. There's our heading level 3, and there's our input field. However, if we type into this field, green apple, and try to save this WordPress post, so publish and update, if I leave this screen and then come back to that screen, so go back into that post, you can see that it did not save what I typed into that field. And this is because we never told WordPress that that input field has any sort of relationship to our content attribute. Remember, we've got these two attributes, and they are the pieces of data that we need to hold on to, our text content and the color. So let me show you what I would do. Let's jump back into Babel to work with our intuitive JSX code. At this point, you might be thinking to yourself, I wish we didn't have to work in the browser because now we're going to have to recopy and paste, and it's awkward to keep jumping back and forth between the browser and our text editor. Well, I will let you know that in the real world, professional developers are not jumping back and forth between their text editor and their browser like this. In the real world, you can set up an automated workflow so that we could write intuitive JSX code right in our JavaScript file here. However, in order to set up that automated workflow, you would need to be at least a little bit familiar with things like node and npm and the command line. And in this lesson, I don't want to assume that you're familiar with all of those things. So in this lesson, we are going to keep awkwardly jumping back and forth between our text editor and the Babel website. But if you are a bit more advanced and you are familiar with the JavaScript ecosystem, things like node and npm in the command line, I recommend you check out this popular package named Create Gutenberg. It's going to set up that automated workflow for you. I'm not going to use it in this lesson, so I'm not going to run through the instructions, but if you're familiar with npm and the command line, these instructions are super easy to follow. So this is what I would use in the real world so that I could write JSX directly in my text editor here. But in this lesson, I don't want to exclude people who maybe aren't familiar with the command line and node and npm and all of that. So stick with me. Let's just keep using the Babel tool for the simplicity of this lesson. Okay, back to the task at hand. We need to tell WordPress that this input element is related to our content attribute, right? So that that data actually gets saved and stored. So what I would do is on this input element, I would give it an onChange handler. So onChange equals, and then let's include a pair of curly brackets. In this context, the curly brackets tell JSX that we want to do something dynamic. Now let's make up a function name that we will create in a minute or two from now. Could be anything, but I'm going to call it update content. So now, after every keystroke when the user is typing into this field, this function is going to be called. So then we can create a function with this matching name, and in it we can update the content attribute to whatever the value of this input field currently is set to. Now before we recopy and paste this code into our text editor, let's first add one more attribute to the input. let's say value equals, and then curly brackets, and let's say props.attributes.content. This way, when a user edits an existing post that's using this block type, the existing or previous value will be pre-populated into the input field. All right, now let's go ahead and recopy and paste this into our text editor. So copy this. Back in our edit method, let's change what gets returned. So I'm just going to delete from right after the word return down to the parentheses semicolon. Delete that and just repaste in. Okay, and if we just told this element to run a function named update content after every keystroke or every change, we better create a function with that matching name. So within our edit method, maybe right above the line where we return something, let's create a function. So function, I chose a name of update content, parentheses, curly brackets. And what do we want to do? We want to update the content attribute. To do that, we can work with props, which is going to get passed into our function. And it has a method named setAttributes. We pass this method an object, and we let it know which attribute we want to update. In this case, it's content, and we want to set it to whatever that input field currently contains, right? Whatever the user has typed in. Now, every time that input field calls this function, it's going to pass along the event as an argument. So let's receive that event as a parameter. So in these parentheses, I will say event. Okay, and then what did we want to set the content to? We can just say event.target.value. In other words, whatever element called this function, grab its value. Okay, now let's go ahead and save and take it for a test drive. Back in WordPress, be sure to refresh this screen. And now in this field, I will type green apple, click update to save that. And then if I leave this screen and come back to it, awesome, you can see that it saved my input. All right, next, let's work on adding a color picker field right about here. Now I have some good news. We do not need to code and develop our own color picker from scratch. We do not need to reinvent the wheel. WordPress has a bunch of pre-existing components that we can leverage. So check this out. If you open up the JavaScript console for your web browser while you're on the edit screen, and if you type in wp.components and push enter, and then if we expand this, you can see that there are all sorts of different built-in components that we can leverage. And there just so happens to be one named Color Picker. So let me show you how we can use this in our JSX code. Let's jump back over to Babel, and over in our left-hand column, right below the input field, let's create a new element and just say Color Picker. Well, to be more precise, in front of Color Picker, we should say wp.components.colorpicker. Be sure to capitalize the C in color and the P in picker. The beauty of React is that we can leverage reusable components like this and basically pretend that they are native HTML elements. Now, just like we tied our input field to our content attribute, we need to tie the color picker to our color attribute, right? So that the value actually gets saved. So let's do this. On this element, let's give it a few attributes. Instead of onChange, we want to give it an attribute named onChangeComplete. This way, when the user is dragging the color selector, the color value doesn't get updated 1,000 times per second. So the word complete here will just make sure that whatever function we pass this will only be called an appropriate number of times. So let's say onChangeComplete equals curly brackets. Let's make up a function name. I will say update color. Okay, and just like with our input field, we want to pre-populate it with the existing value if it has one. Now, instead of value for the color picker, we want to use an attribute named color. That's just what the creator of this component chose. So let's say color equals curly brackets and then props.attributes.color. Okay, now let's go ahead and recopy and paste the generated code over in the right-hand column. So copy that, back in our text editor. Now inside our edit method, be sure to keep our update content function that we created. And the only part that we want to update is what's getting returned. So right after the word return, down to the parentheses, semicolon, repaste in. Okay, now every time the color picker field gets updated, it's going to try to call a function named update color. So we want to be sure to create a function with that name. So right above the return, we could just say function update color, parentheses, curly brackets. Just like we did before, we want to call props.setAttributes. So props.setAttributes, pass it an object, and we want to update the color attribute. Its value is going to come from the color picker component. Now, every time that color picker component calls this function, it's going to pass it its value. So within these parentheses, let's include a parameter. We could call it value to receive it. And then down here, let's say color should equal value.hex, because we are interested in the hexadecimal color code specifically. All right, at this point, let's go ahead and save the file and test it out. So back in the admin dashboard, be sure to refresh the edit screen. We see green apple. Let's go ahead and choose a matching green color now. I will save or update the WordPress post, and if I leave this screen and then come back to it, awesome. You can see that it saved our green color. Now let's change gears. The editing experience for our block is done at this point. Now let's focus on the HTML that it actually outputs, right? The content that you would see on the front end of the website for this block. Because at the moment, if I save this post and try to view it on the front end, you can see that the content area is completely blank. And that's because back in our text editor, remember down at the very bottom of our code, the save method isn't returning anything. It's just returning null. So let's write a bit of JSX that would create the appropriate HTML that we would want to see on the front end. So let's jump over to Babel. I want a clean slate, so I'm going to completely erase the left-hand column. If you want to copy and paste this into a blank text editor just for reference, that's okay, but I'm going to delete it. Okay, and at the end of the day, what do we want this block to generate? What do we actually want to see on the front end of our site? How about a heading level 3? And inside the heading, we would want to see whatever text the user typed into the field. So curly brackets, and we would just say props.attributes.content. Okay, and then we want to give it a thick border of the selected color. So on the opening H3 tag, we can just say style equals curly brackets to do something dynamic. And then inside those curly brackets, let's include another inner pair of curly brackets because we want to pass style an object. So the property would just be the name of the CSS property, in this case border colon. And then we could include a string of text here, so quotes, and then say a 5 pixel thick solid red border. But we don't want to hard code the color value. So instead of quotes for a simple string of text, we can swap out the quotes for backticks. This is the character to the left of the 1 key on your keyboard. Be sure to change the closing quote to a backtick as well. And now that lets us do something dynamic inside this string of text. Actually, it's no longer a simple string of text. The backticks turn it into a template literal. And now we have a superpower. So we can get rid of red and say $ curly brackets. Inside the curly brackets, we can pull in a dynamic value. So we can just say props.attributes.color. If you're having a hard time typing this out, don't worry. In the resources or description for this lesson, I will include a link with the final product JavaScript that you can just copy and paste if you want to. Anyways, let's go ahead and copy and paste this generated code into our JavaScript file. So copy that. Down at the bottom, in our save method, instead of returning null, we want to return our clipboard. So paste it in. Before I save this, one final public service announcement. Remember that in the real world, you don't want to leave this as React. You'd want to swap this out for WP Element. I haven't been doing this every step of the way just to speed up the lesson a bit, but you get the idea. Okay, let's go ahead and save that and jump back into WordPress. Now, if we refresh the front end for that post, nothing is going to change. And that's because WordPress doesn't directly use your block type anywhere except the edit screen. So we can't retroactively update blocks with our code like that. We need to actually go back in to the edit screen for that post. And as soon as we refresh this edit screen, WordPress is actually going to show an error message for the block. So check this out. If I refresh, we see this message. This block contains unexpected or invalid content. Now, my own personal opinion, I'm not sure if I agree with this decision that WordPress made, but I realized that they had good intentions. So essentially, anytime the output for your block changes at all, so previously it was set to null when we saved our block, and then obviously this code is way different than null. But anytime the output of our save method changes at all, it's going to invalidate our block. And WordPress is going to say, no way. Your block's code is not allowed to change the user's content without the user's permission. So it's going to show this message to the end user. They have a few different options. In our case, we just want to delete this block so we can insert the new updated version of the block. So I'm just going to click Convert to HTML and then delete the block entirely. So remove block and then just reinsert a new copy of the block. So my cool border box, insert it again. I'll need to type in the value again. So green apple. Choose a green color. Click update. And now if we go check the front end and refresh, awesome. There's our text and there is the appropriate border color. Just to show the reusable nature of blocks, why don't we add another block that says banana and it has a yellow border. So back in here, we could just add another my cool border box. Say banana. Choose a yellow. Update. Go refresh the front end. Awesome. Now that concludes the hands-on portion of this lesson, but at the end here, I do want to address a few common concerns or questions you might have. And I will also give you an extra credit assignment. So first of all, let's talk about that weird situation where WordPress did not want us updating the save method. Let me show you how this works. So back in our code, even if we change something super subtle, so if we change this from a heading level 3 to a heading level 4, even something super subtle like this, if I save that and then go back into WordPress and refresh the edit screen, WordPress goes, nope, no way. This block now has unexpected or invalid content. When I first saw this behavior, I thought I was doing something wrong as a developer or that I had ran into a bug, but this is actually the intended behavior of WordPress. The creators of WordPress really do not want a plugin to be able to change the HTML content of a post basically without the express written consent of the user or author. Now, I understand why WordPress would set things up this way, but in my opinion, this greatly reduces the usefulness of blocks. Personally, I would never use a block like this on any of the websites that I maintain. To me, the whole idea of a block is that I would want to be able to change the code in one location and potentially have it update hundreds of instances across my website. I think that would be awesome. However, by default, that is not how blocks work. You would need to go into each individual post and not only resave the post, but you would need to delete the invalidated or outdated instance of the block and reinsert it. So as a web developer and maintainer of large websites, I can't really endorse using blocks like this. However, this type of a block is great for a sort of site builder experience or a WYSIWYG experience or a drag and drop editor. But because the data or attributes are so closely tied and married to the HTML, the whole situation is just super unattractive to me as a developer. And maybe that's okay, right? The whole idea of the new block editor is that it gives the end user more control, but not necessarily the developer. Now, if you are a control-hungry developer, if you maintain websites and you want all the control in the world from within your code, I do have some good news. Instead of this default block that we just created, you can create something called a dynamic block. Now, I've seen conversations on GitHub where the creators of the new block editor sort of discourage you from using dynamic blocks unless you really need to. So the idea behind a dynamic block is that you use JavaScript for your edit method, right? You use JavaScript for the user interface in the edit screen, but then you would use PHP to generate the output HTML on the fly. And your JavaScript save method would take a hands-off approach and simply return null. Now again, I've seen the creators of WordPress say that you should really only use a dynamic block if you really need to use PHP to fetch something dynamic from the database or some other PHP heavy task. However, and this is the control-hungry developer in me speaking, what I think is pretty cool is to use a dynamic block even if I don't need to do anything inherently PHP-ish, because a dynamic block does not throw a fit if the output changes. Basically, if you want to create a dynamic block, you would just set your save method to return null, just like we had before earlier in the lesson, return null, and you would let PHP generate the output on the fly. To do that, and again, you can pull up this same documentation that I'm looking at by Googling WordPress creating dynamic blocks, but to achieve this, in your PHP plugin file, you would just say register block type, include the short name or variable name of your block type, and then give it a render callback. So this is a PHP function. You can choose whatever name you want here. And then that function can just return a simple string of HTML. Again, the reason I would do this is because you are free to update the HTML that function returns as many times as you want in the future. And it's not going to show this little message, right? This block contains unexpected or invalid content. Now, the question is this abusing the whole idea of a dynamic block? Is this really how the creators of WordPress want you to create your blocks? Probably not, or maybe it is. The new block editor has only been out for about a month or less at the time of this recording, so only time will tell. All I can say is that as a web developer and maintainer of large websites, I love the idea of dynamic blocks. My end users would be free to use blocks throughout hundreds or even thousands of blog posts, and then if I just make one change in that PHP function, the users don't need to go into each individual post on the admin. The front end of the website is just automatically updated. To me, this is the best of both worlds. The admin editing experience is really intuitive. It's using the React library. It's very fast and modern, but the data isn't so married to the final HTML that it leaves a bit of freedom from the developer side. All right, now the next thing I want to address at the end here is the idea of using a custom block to store a meta value, like you would with a custom field, instead of using a block just to generate HTML. In order to show you what I mean, and also just to learn more about blocks in general, let's take a look at my database. All right, so this is the database entry for that post that I was working on. And here is the post content field. Before the block editor, this is where just our standard HTML would live, right? Paragraphs, headlines, unordered lists, and that's still basically what's going on. I think you'll be surprised how simple the new block editor actually is in terms of what it saves to the database. So this is that first instance, the green apple box, and this is the second instance, the yellow banana box. Let's look at the first instance. In the middle, we just see a bit of static, plain old-fashioned HTML. This is the output that our block generates. But you can see that before and after that HTML, there are comments. The comments say which block type this section is using. And then right after that, on this opening comment, we see an object, a JavaScript object with our different attributes, right? Content and color. At the end of the day, that's all a block is from the database perspective. Now we can start to see why the creators of WordPress did not want to let your save method change the HTML output. The idea is that the HTML in this field should be considered sacred or untouchable. Once the end user has generated a bit of HTML, nothing should be able to change it without their permission. And at the end of the day, even though I'm a control-hungry developer, I can totally understand and respect the decision by WordPress to invalidate your block if this would change. Now, obviously, the user is free to change the dynamic aspects of this output, like the color or the text content. But anything that's not dynamic, anything that's coming from our save method, is not allowed to change. Now, if we were using a dynamic block, this content would not exist because we set the output to just be null. But these comments would still be in place. So WordPress would see, aha, this section should use this block type, and this is the raw data and attributes. And then as long as you registered your block type in your PHP, like we saw just a moment ago, remember, register block type, and then you give it a render callback PHP function, WordPress would know to use that to generate the HTML on the fly. So no HTML would exist in the database for that block. All right, now on a slightly related topic, let's talk about meta fields or post-meta. For example, what if we did not want a traditional block like this that stores the HTML in the database, nor did we want a dynamic block that is still going to use PHP to dynamically insert the HTML on the fly? What if we don't necessarily want our block and its data to be tied to any sort of HTML whatsoever? What if we simply wanted to store these data values like banana and the color code for yellow? What if we wanted to save those values somewhere else in the database besides this smushed together post content field? Well, that's what post meta is for, metadata. It's its own separate area in the database. Earlier in the course, we learned how to query for certain posts depending on certain metadata values, right? This is how you can create relationships between posts, like saying a certain professor teaches a certain subject or teaches at a certain campus. Creating relationships is just one example use of metadata. Big picture, there's a million different reasons of why you'd want to create metadata for a post. And at first glance, you might think that the block editor isn't going to play nicely with metadata, but that's not the case. It's actually very simple. So let's imagine that I wanted to save this value of green apple, or whatever the user entered for content. Imagine I wanted to save that into a meta field. All you need to do is go into your JavaScript, and up towards the top of our block, look in your attributes area. For content, inside the object that describes content, we could just say, comma, source should be meta, and this is where you choose the meta name. You could choose anything, unicorn, pizza, content. Okay, that's step one. There's only one more step. Because the block paradigm is powered by JavaScript, not PHP, we need to make sure that this metadata of content is available in the REST API, right? Because that's how JavaScript is going to get access to the data. So in your plugins PHP, you would just want to include something like this. This is pulled directly from the official WordPress documentation. All it's doing is registering your metadata. So for post, that would be the name of your post type. Maybe it's professors, maybe it's campuses, or maybe it really is just post. This second argument is the name of your metadata. So that could be content or color or whatever you choose. And then you just need to set the option show in REST to true. By default, the REST API doesn't show all metadata for a post. So this is just enabling that. And that's all we have to do. So now when you type in this value, banana or green apple, that's going to be saved as a piece of metadata for that post. At that point, it's up to you how you use the metadata. You'd access it just like you normally would from your front-end PHP theme files, or you can access it with JavaScript from the REST API. Okay, and now to close out the lesson, if you are going to be using metadata, you might not want to rely on your end user having to manually insert your block. If we think about how plugins like advanced custom fields work, the idea is that your end user is presented with a predetermined set of blocks, or I should say custom fields. This way, the end user doesn't have to remember to insert a certain block or field. The fields are just there in their face, waiting to be filled out. Believe it or not, the new block system has something like this baked into its core. So this is the official WordPress documentation on the block editor. There is a page called Templates. And essentially, for a certain post type, you can register a block template. Meaning, when someone creates a new post of that certain post type, you can define programmatically which blocks should appear. So that way the user doesn't have to manually insert certain block types, because we can't expect the end user to know which data we want them to fill in. I think that this block template feature has tremendous potential, but if I'm being perfectly honest, instead of setting all of this up myself, I would probably just continue to use the Advanced Custom Fields plugin. The team behind that plugin have spent thousands and thousands and thousands of hours perfecting the plugin. So unless I needed to do something super custom that plugin did not allow for, or unless I wanted to create my own competing plugin, I'd probably just use Advanced Custom Fields when it comes to metadata and meta fields. Okay, now changing gears, before we finally bring this lesson to a close, I want to give you an extra credit assignment. So back into the WordPress editor, I think it would be cool if this area that says Your Cool Border Box instead said preview : and then maybe it would show whatever text you've typed into this field, and it had the matching border of whatever color you chose, and the idea is that it updates in real time. It updates every time a keystroke occurs in this field and every time a new color is chosen. Now, the good news is that that's kind of the entire point of the React library. Every time our attributes get updated, this component is going to re-render. So I won't spoil the fun for you, but I will give you a hint. In your JSX for the edit method, right, where we have the input field and the color picker component, all you would really need to do is adjust this heading level 3. You could really just copy and paste the code from your save method. So you could output the content attribute here, and you could output the style attribute on the opening tag. It's a basic example, but I think it'll open your eyes to what's possible in the editor. React really does create some amazing opportunities for intuitive user interfaces. Okay, and that does bring the lesson to a close. We've only scratched the surface of what's possible with blocks, but you are now familiar with the very basics. From here, the possibilities are limitless. If you made it till the very end of this lesson, give yourselves a pat on the back. We covered a lot of ground. At this point, I encourage you to go experiment, and most importantly, have some fun while you're doing it. Take care.